Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Da Jesus an dem Kreuze stund, which translates to as Jesus stood on the cross. Fairly straightforward chorale. I was looking at some of the commentary about this chorale and why it didn't make it into the earlier portion of the BWV numbers, and it seems as if it was just an editorial error. It was a part of a couple of different collections and just didn't get added as an editorial oversight. So not super exciting, but we have a fairly straightforward chorale today. Definitely more in Bach's style in comparison to the chorales we've been looking at recently. And I think we're just going to hop right into the analysis. There's really only one takeaway from this chorale that I'll talk about as we get to it. So we start off on E major. We end with E major. It's kind of an interesting talking point as well, where we end on a half cadence. Typically we end with a authentic cadence, usually a perfect authentic cadence, but that indicates to us that we're in the key of A minor with all of the pitch content and context we have going on here. We then have a bit of a pedal chord, E, E, A, and C. I think this G sharp is like a reverse suspension. There's a word for that, I still haven't looked it up, but I think that we're really getting our tonic here in second inversion, A minor over E. Then we get E, E, G sharp, and B on the next beat. That would be our 5 chord again with a, sorry, am I reading that right? No, it'd be E, E, A, and B. Sorry, I always get, it's really hard for me to read rhythm, so a 5 chord still being implied here, but we have a 4-3 suspension over our 5 chord, which is really common over dominant triads that are in root position, especially. A little delayed passing 7th there as well before we get F, C, A, and A. That's our 6 chord, F major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get D, F, G, and B. This is actually G sharp carried over from earlier in the measure. That would make this G sharp fully diminished 7th over D, which would be second inversion, 7, 4, 3. 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm here, leaving us with C, E, A, and C, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. And then we get B, D, G sharp, and D. I think this A is a 7-6 suspension. Very common to see these over first inversion triads, namely 7th chords, or 7 chords, not 7th chords. Doesn't necessarily have to have the 7th in there. In fact, if I had to hedge my bets, I would say it most commonly happens over triads, because triads are so much more common than 7th chords anyways. Regardless, we would expect a tonic after this, which is what we get. A, E, A, and C, A minor, root position, and then we get a 4-3 suspension half cadence, E, E, G sharp, and B. 5 chord, root position. Next phrase, we actually get a mid-phrase modulation because our phrase ends in the key of D minor, but we start the phrase off in the key of C major. So we get the resolution to our half cadence, A, E, A, and C, tonic triad, root position. And this is also serving as our 6 chord in the key of C major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get F, D, A, and D, D minor over F, 2, 6. 6 going to 2 is a relatively normative progression because of the cycle of falling fifths. D is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark that. And then we get G, D, G, and B, which is our 5 chord G major with a passing 7th in the bass. And then we get C major, E, C, G, and C in first inversion. So we have a pair of root position triads and a pair of first inversion triads that bridge the gap between them, which is why this progression really feels like a C major. Passing 7th in the melody, and then we get D, C, G, and A. We have a bit of a double suspension going on here. Maybe there's more interesting stuff going on in this chorale than I had noted, but yeah, there's kind of like a double suspension, except one resolves upwards and one resolves downwards. It's a 4-3 suspension here in the alto, but this would be our 2 chord in first inversion, D minor over F, which I also think is operating as our tonic in the key of D minor, because we get C sharp on the next beat too, which is kind of a clue into the fact that we've modulated, but not always. Most of the time though. We get C sharp, A, E, and A, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, A major. passing 7th in the melody, D, A, E, and F. 9/8 suspension here over the bass. Very common to see 9/8 suspensions over the bass with root position tonic triads. Then we get our 5 chord, A, C sharp, and E, marking the end of our phrase with our half cadence. Okay, next phrase takes us to the key of C major again. However, similar to the phrase we just analyzed, there's going to be a mid-phrase modulation that pivots us to the key, or to another key. In this case, it's G major. So we start the phrase off with C major, and here's one of the interesting talking points that I was referring to at the beginning of the video. We have D minor, which resolves our half cadence, D, F, A, and D. However, I think in addition to this being 2 in the key of C major with this as a passing tone, usually what would happen here is if we were already in the key of C major, this A would be an accented non-chord tone, and I would analyze this B as the root of the chord. So here we might have a 2 to 7 progression, which is kind of rare, but I generally speaking don't think that one voice can constitute a chord progression. If only one voice is moving, it's usually the chord morphing from one to the other. Usually I think at least 2 voices need to move in order to constitute a chord progression. That's just my opinion based on how I've been analyzing Bach so far, but this is a case of this idea of tonicizing 2/7. So D minor is the 2 in the key of C major, but it's also being contextualized very closely to 7, and it's being morphed from the chord that's being tonicized, which is D minor, and turning into B diminished. So really it's just semantics, how you want to go about analyzing it, but it's not the end of the world if you analyze this as a 2 going to 7 progression. I just think as far as predominant and dominant chords are concerned, 2 and 7 as a combination is just the objectively weakest progression of the 2 when you're talking about root relationships and the effect that a predominant to dominant chord progression has, narratively speaking, because the roots are so close to one another and they share so many tones in common. But yeah, if this is a situation where 2 is almost operating, or the chord here, because they're separated by only one tone, it's sort of operating as 2 chords at the same time, depending on where you are in the beat. Which is slightly different in my opinion than a chord progression, but I've talked about this in the past. I have situations like this written in my notes as tonicization of 2, but it's kind of veiled in this case because we are in D minor kind of at the same time as we modulate to the key of C here. But regardless, we get C major afterwards, C, G, C, and E, passing 7th in the bass, A, C, and E. It's our 6th chord, A minor, passing tone in the melody, B, G, D, and G. G major over B, which is 5/6, passing tone in the tenor. Then we get G, B, D, and G, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position before we get C, G, D, and E. And I'm going to analyze this as 1. However, you could analyze this because there is a 9/8 suspension over the bass as 6/6. I will analyze this A as a non-chord tone as well, because I think it's just one of those chords that Bach is changing up another tone at the same time as the resolution to the suspension. However, what is happening here is at the same time, I'm actually going to remove this so I have enough space and then refactor it later. But I think what's happening here is in the key of G major, this is operating as 4 or 2/6, something like that. It just depends on how you interpret the chord. I think to me this is a C major chord with a 9/8 suspension, but you could interpret it as a 2/6 chord as well. 2/6 chords are much more common in authentic cadences, but 2, 6, and 4 are so similar already. I really don't think it makes too much of a difference. But regardless, that takes us to 5, D major, D, A, C, and F sharp, actually D7, because we have C in there. A little neighbor tone here as well in the alto. D is a chord tone, C is a chord tone in this case, and we get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major here. Starting off the next phrase, we get a a phrase that's sort of a kindred spirit to the second phrase, where we start in the key of C major and we move to the key of D minor by the end of the phrase, where we end in a half cadence. We get G major at the beginning, but we have F natural here in the bass. So not only is it operating as R1 in the key of G major, G, B, and B. Sorry, this is a D, not a B. It's also operating as our 5 in the key of C major, and then we get our tonic E, G, E, and C, 1, 6, neighbor tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, and then we get E, G, G, and B. Kind of an interesting chord here. I think there's an argument to be made that this could be first inversion tonic 7th chord, but I think that this B in the melody is consciously being avoided as the tonic 7th here, because Bach switches up the use of C in any other voices to make the argument for it being a tonic triad on the harmonic rhythm, but it does technically introduce a tonic 7th chord on the end of the beat with C, G, E, and B natural. Whether or not the tonic triad's actually there, or sorry, the tonic 7th is actually there, is up for debate, I suppose. I guess literally, if you're analyzing it, yes, but it could just be counterpoint where C sort of making the 4th-based movement to kind of quasi-tonicize F. That's happening. However, instead of B flat, we have B natural. It's not the first time we've seen a situation like this, but afterwards we get F major, F, A, C, and A, which is our 4 chord. Passing tones in the inner voices, which leave us with F, B, D, and A. B minor 7 flat 5 over F, which is 7, 4, 3. 4 going to 7 is probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of Bach's chorales, but we see others as well. It's very common though. And then we get C major, C, C, E, and G, which is our tonic. We get a little neighbor tone here in the bass, which kind of outlines a little bit of melodic minor here with B, C sharp, and D, which kind of indicates to me that we've moved to the key of D minor and we're modulating using the subdominant 7th. But on top of that, it's very common. I can't really sling the word "very" around unless it is very common. It's not unheard of for Bach to modulate using the subtonic 7th, and a lot of the times it's followed sort of in this chromatic bass line fashion with C natural, C sharp, and D in this case, but really the flatted 7th, the leading tone, and the tonic of the scale, where the leading tone turns into the 3rd of the 5 chords. So we usually see in this context 7 going to 5, 6 going to 1, which is exactly what's happening here. C sharp, A, E, and A. Sometimes we see it morphed into a 7 chord as well, a diminished 7 chord, rather than a major 7 chord. But A is a chord tone, G is the passing 7th here in the melody, then we get D minor, again with the 9/8 suspension, similar to the second phrase in the chorale, which is implying our tonic, and then we get A major, A, C sharp, and E. Sorry, not our tonic, our dominant A major, which is just like the ending of the second phrase in the chorale. But we're going to close out the chorale with a phrase in the key of A minor. However, we get another set of mid-phrase modulations with these B flats as well, which is kind of interesting. We'll talk about that when we get there, but it ends in a half cadence, which is another talking point. So we have D, F, A, and D, which is our tonic in the key of D minor, and it is our 2 chord in the key of C major. Sorry, I was thinking about the end of the chorale. And then we have this idea of maybe the passing 7 going on here, but I really think that this chord, especially with D chords, now that I think about it, it's interesting when Bach plays with the role of the chord. Is it a 2 chord? Is it a 7 chord? It's functioning like as a resolution to the previous half cadence, but also presenting itself as a diminished triad because only one voice is moving. I talked about it earlier in the chorale. But then we go to our tonic again, C, G, C, and E, just like our 3rd phrase. Passing tone in the bass, E, C, C, and G. We also have a passing tone here in the melody, which is this chord on beat 2 is our tonic triad in first inversion, and the chord briefly goes back to root position on the end of the beat with C, E, and G. Then we get F major, F, C, F, and A, which is our 4 chord, passing tone in the bass, and we're closing in on this B flat here. So I think A, C, F, and A is not only inverting our F chord, but we're very, very briefly entering the key of F major, where this is now our, sorry, not our 4 chord, it's because I just said that it was a 4 chord, I wrote that. It's now our tonic triad, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get C major with a 4-3 suspension over it, which indicates that it's probably a dominant, because we often see 4-3 suspensions over root position dominant chords. So C is operating as our 5, a little delayed passing 7th, ease the resolution to the suspension so we don't have to mark anything, and then we get D minor here with a 9/8 suspension over the bass. It's more common to see those over tonic triads, but I guess D is sort of operating as a tonic in this case because it is the end of a deceptive progression, 5 going to 6, D, A, D, and F. And it also gets contextualized here with this B natural like we've seen earlier as well. So maybe there is a theme of B diminished and D minor sharing a space, or sort of like butting up against one another. But I'm going to just say that this is D minor for the sake of simplicity here, because it is going to be the gateway back to the key of A minor for the end of the chorale, where it is now operating as 4, our minor 4. B is a non-chord tone, A is a non-chord tone, C is delayed passing 7th here before we get E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our 5 chord in root position, and that is today's analysis. As far as takeaways are concerned, the fact that we end with a half cadence is kind of interesting, because most chorales end with a perfect authentic cadence, at least usually some type of authentic cadence. We get mid-phrase modulations pretty consistently throughout this chorale. That is to suggest that typically when Bach modulates, he stays in the key. He'll modulate to one key in the next phrase and cadence in that same key without having visited anything else in between. But here, pretty much every phrase has at least one mid-phrase modulation where he'll start in one key and end in a different key. We also have this idea of 2 being tonicized as 7, this idea of B diminished and D minor coexisting on the same beat, and how exactly is the chord to be interpreted. Is this a 2 to 7 chord progression, which is pretty rare when you look at it in terms of chord progressions that happen from harmonic rhythm to harmonic rhythm. And I feel like there's something else that I'm missing as well. Oh, we have a double suspension going on here in the alto and the tenor here in the first system. But other than that, there is a little reference to a tonic 7th going on here. I'm not sure exactly how much stake I put in that, but it might be there. It's happening very briefly and in passing. I think I'll leave that up to you in terms of how seriously you want to analyze that. But other than that, I think those are the big takeaways, and I think we can cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.